typically our legal system is ready for, that it's a square hole meets round. Scott, I think, is going to come at it from the perspective of this. One way we approach this problem is to look at how do companies get themselves ready to fit into that round hole, right? How do we actually deal with the compliance challenges we face? And the other problem is, like, how do we get the law to somehow, mold to this world that millennials and the rest of us are looking for? And Perianne Boring, who is the founder and president of the Chamber of Digital Commerce and represents the digital asset industry that includes cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, but all sorts of other related digital asset ventures, is in that business of trying to educate policymakers. So let's take a seat, and we'll just start it off from here, because, as I say, I think this is one of the biggest challenges. It's one of the things that makes it hard to disrupt money. We talked at the very beginning about, how we're at the cusp of this moment where we could indeed reform a 500-year-old industry. And it has taken this long in some respects because of regulation. So let's dive in. But first of all, Scott, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what you guys do, and then what is the big theme that you're seeing? What is the message that you're delivering to startups in this business?
Yeah. Is my mic on? Oh, there we go. So we are an interesting firm, which is a political consultancy meets venture model. So we mostly work with startups that have some sort of reputational, political, or regulatory challenge, and we work with them to figure out how to change that. So sometimes that looks like changing their behavior and changing their practices, and making sure that they are bulletproof in terms of the things that they're doing and how they're going about it. And sometimes it means engaging their user base, engaging lawmakers, engaging the public, and changing the narrative around what they're doing and how they can do it better. Part of it's you have a square peg and a round hole, and it's how do you kind of shave off the edges around the corners so that you can try and fit both sides in and make the shape different.
And how easy is it? I mean, are these, and I suppose it must vary across users, apps, companies, industries, right? But I mean,
it's tough. I mean, I think what's interesting is if you look at certain industries that are being disrupted, and you look at the politics behind it, there's a couple of things that make it likely to be successful. So usually you have to have the thing that's being disruptive be something that people generally aren't particularly happy with. So if you take an example like Uber, which is a very classic example, was one of our early clients. Even in New York, which has, I would argue, the best taxi, yellow taxi industry in the market, it still wasn't that great. And then if you looked across the rest of the country, it was just a terrible experience. So when the company comes in and says, we're just going to make it better, everybody looked and said, we have this crummy thing, and now we have this better thing, and we just want that. So that's really useful. But then the other thing that's useful is there are certain industries and things where we have a basic understanding that something's illegal and why it's illegal, and that's harder to change. But in a lot of stuff, especially when you go deep on certain issues, whether it's Bitcoin or taxis or a lot of this stuff, if you asked 100 people on the street, 99 of them couldn't even tell you what was illegal about it in the first place. And so that's another useful thing, is to have an industry where you can actually say, it's not even clear to the public why you can't do the thing you want to do. And then I think the last thing is you have to be prepared with a very compelling story, a great product, and a really clear strategy around who matters, who you need to go after. You don't want to be distracted by big, flashy, shiny objects. I mean, we could, you could go out and get 2 million people to sign a petition to President Obama to make it easier to use Bitcoin, and it's not really clear that that would solve the bit license problem in New York State, right? So part of it is about having a very clear understanding of who your constituencies are, what they care about, which is often very different from what a normal person would care about. Elected officials have a very, very clear understanding of who matters to them, and part of our job is to make it clear to our companies that that's who they need to focus on. So it's not, people between the ages of 18 and 24 who have never been inside a ballot booth. It's looking at triple prime voters in a specific constituency that matters to that committee chairman on this issue.
And I'd say it's probably not just the elected officials. Obviously, they're the ones who are going to drive the policy, but you've got entrenched bureaucracies have always done things always the same way. And again, square peg, round hole. Very hard to get those practices to change.
I mean, it's a bit of a stereotype, right, that if you take a typical kind of government official, their primary goal is to figure out how to leave at 4:30 instead of 5 o'clock. And I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I don't think it's not universal, but I do think that government does not incentivize the people who work there to take risks. And so you do have to figure out what is the reason why they should do this, what's the politics behind it, and then even potentially go up the chain a few steps and figure out who's the decision maker, who is the person whose job it is to make their jurisdiction better and not just follow the rules that they've been prescripted.
Perianne, you've been there at the coalface dealing with the policymakers themselves, and that's been a pretty interesting ride. We've known each other for a couple of years. I've been covering Bitcoin for a while. Tell us a little bit about that learning process that you've obviously been very, very actively engaged in. What are the challenges you face in trying to get people's heads around something that's very, very different, and how has that progressed over the last couple of years?
Well, building on what you were saying, it's not only that government is not incentivized to meet their constituents' demands, but also these are people who have names to make for themselves. For example, a prosecutor. It looks good if they have their name in the headlines when they're bringing someone to justice, whether or not we agree with what the act was doing was actually criminal activity or not. So you have other types of politics that are influencing the outcome. As far as how easy is it to get someone within government to understand something like Bitcoin or the blockchain? Forget it. I first learned about Bitcoin when I worked on Capitol Hill. I worked for a member of the Financial Services Committee in the US House. I worked on signature legislation, the Jobs Act, which was crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending based, and digital currencies was a related technology that the committee was briefed on. And from the moment I heard about this technology, it really sparked my interest. But even my own personal journey with learning about this technology, I mean, it really took years to fully grasp my head around it. And every day it continues to evolve and change. So it is very difficult to explain something as complicated as distributed ledgers to someone who works in government. And firsthand experience when I worked on the Hill, my policy portfolio included financial services, so that was budget, tax, anything dealing with money, and then also healthcare, which was a whole nother huge portfolio within itself. So my schedule throughout the day was difficult to keep up with all the various issues. So you have maybe 30 minutes to learn about something new. You cannot learn Bitcoin or blockchain or even the Uber business model from the beginning in that amount of time. So a big challenge is one, sparking someone's interest into why this is.
So you want to sort of thinking about a little bit about that, how do you actually defend your counsel, and how does